What's up guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of Bonsai-U. This time around we're going to be taking a look at a tree that we actually featured in a YouTube video a couple of years ago, and that is this Japanese maple kabudachi or clump style tree beside me here. Now, if you recall that video, I actually put this tree together when I was 16 years old in a workshop with Bill Valvanis, who is the founder of International Bonsai and International Bonsai magazine up in Rochester, New York. Bill and I have since become good friends, and I see him all over the world at various conventions nowadays. But that was 20 years ago when I put this together, and you can see just how far along the tree has come in that period of time. These guys were tiny little seedlings at that time, and we put them together with just a zip tie at the base, planted them in a nursery container, and over the years it's developed into this very well refined, very well developed Japanese maple kabudachi style tree. Now, in this episode, what I'd like to do is walk you through what I've done to the tree over the last couple of years since we actually featured it on YouTube, as well as talk about how to refine the silhouette on this tree during the winter season. At this stage, we're kind of moving into refinement with this plant, so I'm looking to soften the structure, create a bit of taper in the branches, and just make the overall silhouette a little bit nicer at this time of year. Now, in terms of what's been done to this tree over the last couple of years, I have actually up-potted it a couple of times into slightly larger containers with the intention of thickening the base of the plant, or thickening that sort of pancake nabari or surface root structure on the tree, as well as thickening some of the trunks within the composition. So the trunks were all about the same diameter. So with up-potting it like this, I also selected out a couple of terminal shoots on a couple of these trunks, including our main trunk here in the center, and allowed those to grow over the last couple of years, cutting them back relatively recently so that it would actually thicken the trunk relative to the others. So they still all have somewhat of a similar diameter, so we're gonna be allowing another terminal shoot on that main trunk to grow this coming year to help with thickening, but we're starting to get a little bit of variation between the trunks. This is one of those things that it's kind of personal taste and personal preference, but in general, having a variation in terms of trunk diameters just makes everything look a bit more balanced and interesting. And this is sort of a standard practice in Japan when it comes to building out a kabudachi style tree like this here. So the tree has been up-potted, like I said. We've been working the roots, fanning things out, trying to get the size of the trunk a little bit larger. And I've also been thickening a few of the branches on the tree as well. Some of those lower primary branches so that we can have bigger branches at the bottom and smaller branches at the top of the tree. But as you can see, the tree in a lot of areas has thickened too much, and some of that nice soft structure has gotten ruined over the last couple of years, which is to be completely expected. So what we're going to do in this episode is walk you through how I prune back and refine this silhouette. And I think the best way to do that is to bring the camera in a little bit closer and show you some of that structure that needs to be reworked. All right, so first up, let's take a look at one of the branches that I actually let elongate this year to thicken it up, and that is this branch on the rear here. So I let one of the terminal shoots on this guy grow for the last couple of years, and you can see that it's gotten quite chunky out here at the end, and there's actually very little taper from the interior all the way out to about this point. So what I'm gonna do here is actually push this back quite heavily. We're gonna go all the way back to softer growth further back in here. Now at this time of year, which is obviously winter because the tree has no leaves on it, if I were to do a major cutback like this and cut this flush to one of these softer branches here, that is highly likely to kill that branch. So when we make a cut like this, we want to cut at least 1.5 times the diameter of the branch that we're cutting off. We're going to want to leave a stub that's at least that long. So this branch here is about 1.5 pencils thick. So I'm going to go 1.5 times the length of that when I make this cut here. All right, now that I've cut that off here, and you can see we've got a stub, this will die back a little bit over the course of the winter, and come early spring or potentially after the first flush comes out and hardens off, I will then work this back on an angle further back closer to this branch, and that will allow the branches to survive here and also give us nice taper and movement. So I am going to put a little bit of wire on these branches to pull them a little bit closer together, but we'll do that once we go through the entire tree and prune back the structure. So here is another branch that I allowed to grow out to thicken this year, and you can see there's very little taper from the interior out to about this point here. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this back as well. So when we're cutting branches like this back, what we're looking to do again is create taper, movement, and just a soft structure across the tree, and also produce slightly shorter internodes. So you can see on the left-hand side here, there's a very long internode from this bud right here out to the next set of buds. So I certainly wanna cut that back. And again, since we're cutting a larger branch back to a softer branch, we're gonna leave just a tiny little stub for dieback's sake, and then we'll treat that in the spring. On the right-hand side here, again, there's very little taper, and then we've got this really ugly cluster of buds a little bit further out here. So I'm actually gonna push this one back a little bit further to this little branch right here, which will create better taper and movement in the spring. And again, we'll treat these wounds come early spring or late spring once everything hardens off. So this is something you're going to want to do with your Japanese maples every single year. There's always going to be some branch tips that get a little bit overly heavy that are going to need to be pruned back. So it's kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But in doing so, you can create a really nice soft structure on the trees. Now, as I mentioned before, I let the apex on our main trunk, our center trunk here, elongate this year to thicken it up. And in doing so, I actually created some pretty long internodes up here at the top, and I want to go ahead and correct for those. So one thing I'll point out here is that quite often when you do this type of technique of allowing things to grow to thicken, you'll end up with some short internodes and some crazy long internodes. So we can't really correct for this anymore. It's not going to bud further back down here. But since we already have a smaller internode further back down, we can remove these long branches back to those smaller internodes. So these are an opposite leaf pattern tree, obviously, so the leaves and the buds are going to be opposite of one another, and sometimes you'll have a really disparate length and strength between those two. So it's okay to cut one of those off and just leave one in that pair. This here at the end, the bud at the end, will actually bifurcate next year. That'll create a new sort of ramification or a bifurcation in that area that's going to lend itself to be a soft ramification on the top of the tree. But we want to push the growth back first and then grow it out. Otherwise, you're going to end up with these really long, straight sections in your branches, and it's just going to look terrible. So same thing here, tight internode down at the base here. I'm going to take both of these guys off. Down to that. Again, we've got actually one that's dead right here. All right, so we'll break that guy off, and then we've got a long internode and a short internode just below it. So we're gonna go ahead and push back to there. So this is shortening the height of the tree by a good 1 to 2 inches in some areas, which is fine. Again, we want that ramification to start from the interior and work its way out towards the end. So in the event that a larger wound is created, anything that is close to kind of pinky fingernail size or larger, I would want to go ahead and cover that up with cut paste. So I prefer to use just the putty type cut paste. I find it easier to use, but you can also use a liquid cut paste. That's fine as well. But this will help prevent this from drying out too much and from the wound getting any larger and from any disease potentially entering into that wound site. So even if we're leaving a stub in certain areas, if it's a larger stub, I will go ahead and put this cut paste on it. All right, so here is our Japanese maple clump after the initial pruning for our winter silhouette refinement. So you can see I did take a decent amount of ramification off the tree, but again, we're focusing on trying to get softer ramification on the plant, more movement in the branches if possible, and of course taper as well. So it is this 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of scenario. So the more you do this year after year after year, the softer the ramification becomes, and then little by little, you're gonna end up taking off less branching as you move forward. So it's not gonna be this extreme every single time. Now, the next thing here is going to be to wire this tree. And of course, this tree has been wired many times over the last 20 years, but I think that putting too much wire on a Japanese maple like this actually ends up giving you a much harsher look to the plant, a much less naturalistic look. So I would recommend trying to avoid putting too much wire on these plants. We're really gonna focus on using just a few guy wires here and there and maybe some braces to push the branches apart or lower the branches down. so that we can create a much more sort of naturalistic sense within the structure of the tree. And later in this tutorial, I'm going to show you an example of a Japanese maple that was built at the same time as this one, using the same techniques in the same workshop. And it was basically built almost essentially with clip and grow techniques, and you'll be able to see the difference in the harshness of the lines within the branch structure. But before we do that, let's go ahead and put a few guy wires on and a few braces on here and there just to reposition some of the branches into new locations, and then we'll do that comparison. All right, so the first branch I want to lower down with a guy wire is our directional branch on the left side of the tree here. Right now it feels very straight, very flat. I want to add a little bit of curvature to this. So I'm going to be tying the guy wire down to the tie-in wire in the pot, or possibly coming out around the outside of the pot here. Ideally, I think angle-wise it's going to be best if we can find the tie-in wire in here. So I'm going to see if I can excavate that first. But we're going to be essentially looping that through there, putting the guy wire over the top and really cranking this down. And when I move these branches into place today, I'm going to over-exaggerate them because they are going to pop up a little bit over time. All right, so I'm unable to find the tie-in wire that we used to lock the tree into the pot on this side, and I don't want to damage the surface roots under here that are going to become our extended nabari. So I'm going to stop at this point. We're actually just going to take the wire out around the outside of the pot here. Even though it's not the most optimal angle, it'll at least get us moving in the right direction. So if I lift the pot up here, I can see that we do have a tie-in wire here. So we're going to loop our piece of copper through there, and then we're going to take it out and around the outside of the pot here. So I am using copper wire obviously for our guy wire here. That's because it's much stronger than aluminum wire and it's not going to stretch nearly as much, so it's much less likely to break as well. That's going to be easier to pull this down. Now, if I just put the copper wire on top of the branch here and pull it down, obviously that's going to bite into the branch. So I'm actually going to use some grafting tape here and wrap it around the branch to be our buffer. If you don't have grafting tape, you could use a piece of plastic tubing or just a small piece of rubber would be fine. But in this instance, I think that the grafting tape is actually going to work the best here. So I don't need very much, just a small strip like this. And I'm going to put this somewhere in this neighborhood right back here. So I'm just going to wrap this around 4 or 5 times here, and that should be enough of a buffer. All right, so the next step is I'm going to meet the two ends of the guy wire right on top of that grafting tape. Then we're going to take our pliers and pull and twist. Now, at this time of year in the winter, this isn't really the optimal time to do super heavy bends. I don't really consider this to be necessarily a very heavy bend on a Japanese maple, but the reason you wouldn't want to go any heavier than this or do anything more extreme than this is because come springtime, the branch may not wake up. So you got to be extra careful. Plus they tend to be quite brittle at this time of year, so you don't want to pull too far and snap the branch. So I'm going to do the same thing or something similar anyway on the right side of the tree here with this branch. On this side though, the tie-in wire is actually exposed on the soil surface here, so we're going to hook it right to that. So it saves us a little bit of trouble. Now in deciding where on the branch to put the buffer or the grafting tape in this case, and where to hook the guy wire, that's going to be dictated by how much bow you want in the branch. So the further out you go on the branch, the more it's going to bow. The further back towards the interior you go, the more of a downward sharp angle you're going to get directly out of the trunk. So with a deciduous tree, particularly maples, I want this upward motion and then downward motion. So I want to go further out on the branch to give us that bowed effect. It just looks much more naturalistic to do it that way. Now, in some instances, you might want to push apart branches or potentially even whole trunks so that you have a better view of all of those trunk lines from the bottom to the top. So one of the best ways to do that is with some heavy duty copper wire. You can cut the copper wire on a point on both ends and then wedge it in between the trunk or the branches that you're trying to spread apart. So I do want to push this trunk here on the right hand side away from our main trunk just a little bit so you can have a better view of those back trunks and it gives you a better sense of depth. So I've already got one point cut on one end. I'm going to go ahead and kind of tentatively measure this out where I want to push these apart. We'll say right about there. And I'd cut it a little bit longer than you think you might need it to start with. So you can always shorten it up. And if you're using copper wire, of course, it's going to work harden. So all you have to do is wiggle it just a little bit to get it to completely harden. And then you can wedge this in between the trees. So again, you can also do this with branches. So if I want to push these two apart, I just cut a piece of copper wire with those 2 points, one on each end, and then we wedge it in between. Now in this case, I cut it just slightly too long. So I'm going to go ahead and shorten it back just a little bit here. And we'll put it in between here just to get a little bit of space. Now, of course, the reason that you're cutting it to a point is so the point actually can be pressed into the tissue on both sides so it doesn't slip out. If you use a chopstick or a wooden dowel, quite often it'll pop out. So I like using this with a pointed end. Now don't worry about the pointed end actually causing any damage to the bark. It might cause like a little bit of swelling right at the base, but that will disappear once you take this pin out in 6 months to a year from now. All right, so before we move on to the next step in the process of winter refinement and winter setup on our Japanese maples, I just want to give you an example of another tree that was designed again at the same time using the same material in the same workshop as this tree, and that is the one on the left over there. And I think it's pretty obvious when you see it in the video that the one on the left has a much softer, more naturalistic, realistic look to it than this one here. And I attribute that to the fact that that tree on the left has only had wire on it maybe twice, possibly 3 times in that entire 20-year period. It was basically wired up to get the sort of primary lines within the primary structure of the trunks, as well as the primary branches were wired at one point, and that's basically it. Everything else on that tree was done essentially through clip and grow. And it has a much softer appearance than this tree. This is just a lot harsher look than that tree, and I think that that's because this tree has been wired dozens of times over the last 20 years. So from my perspective, I've sort of shifted away from doing too much wiring on deciduous material. I used to wire everything out all the way out to the details, and then sort of the idea was that that would soften over time. But as you can see, it really doesn't. If you overdo it, you end up with, I think, a very harsh look to the tree. So I do have to say that tree on the left-hand side there was done by my dad in that same workshop. So we did it as kind of like a father-son hobby when I was younger before I turned it into my career. So it's cool to have both of these trees in my nursery now here, side by side, as kind of legacy trees in the garden. So next step here, we're gonna be taking this tree right here outside. We're gonna go ahead and clean up the bark for the winter, and then we're gonna be painting some lime sulfur onto the bark to brighten it up, make it look nice and white and old, and also to help prevent pests and mostly diseases going into winter storage. So let's dive into that next. So all we want to do here really is just soak the tree down from top to bottom. And then we're going to take either a nylon brush like this one right here or a toothbrush and just start scrubbing up all of the trunks and all of the primary branches on the tree. I'm not really concerned about getting way out onto the tertiary branches, but certainly the primary branches, we want to get all of the gunk off of there. And usually I'll do this once or twice a year. So we'll do it kind of right before we put them into winter storage. And then essentially like maybe early spring when we start working on them again, or possibly after the first flush of growth comes out and hardens off, I might scrub them down again. Then we rinse and repeat at least a couple of times here until all of that green gunk is off of there. All right, so the last step in our process for our winter preparation here is to paint the trunk and the primary branches and maybe some of the secondary branches with lime sulfur. Now you could just take a sprayer and actually spray the entire tree, which is normally what I do. But if we're prepping a tree, say for exhibition, say for example, I want to put this in a show over winter, I don't want the little red buds out here at the end to be covered with lime sulfur because you're going to lose that coloration. Basically, lime sulfur is going to treat for fungal problems, but it's also going to whiten everything up and make the tree look much more vibrant and also a bit older as well. So I don't want to paint those red buds. I want them to be really in stark contrast to the lime sulfur. So I've got the lime sulfur mixed here at about 70% water, 30% lime sulfur. And we're going to go ahead and just paint this all over the nabari trunk, or trunks in this case, and out onto the primary branches here. All right, so here is our Japanese maple kabadachi style tree after winter silhouette refinement, a little bit of wiring here and there, and of course painting up the trunks with lime sulfur. So you can see a lot of those blemishes that were visible in the trunk before it was painted have basically disappeared. So some of those old scars that are a little bit dark in coloration compared to the green color of the sort of young bark, they're completely covered up now, and now it looks a bit more consistent. Now, of course, this lime sulfur is going to wear off over the course of the winter, and we're not going to be repainting it. This is really just a treatment for, again, fungal problems in the winter, kind of before I put these trees away for winter dormancy. But again, if you're going to be putting in an exhibition, this is also a cool thing to do because it makes the tree look significantly older. The older the Japanese maple gets, the more grayed out or white out the bark becomes, and you get this really cool sort of texture to those trunks. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Bonsai-U and sort of going back over something that we haven't talked about in a couple of years at this point. It's always fun to touch back on some of these long-term projects and show you how much they've developed. So we definitely will be covering this tree again in the future as it develops further, so be on the lookout for that. And if you aren't a member of Bonsai-U and you're watching this on YouTube, please consider signing up for the platform. We put out new videos, new demonstrations. I do live Q&As with our membership many times each month, and it's just a lot of fun. We've got a lot of people from all over the world who are part of the community, and it's great to be in touch with those folks and of course ask questions and get advice from folks all over the world. So hope you guys will join. Link in the description down below. Thank you for checking out this episode, and we'll see you next time around. Take care.